gone around, we've taken snippets from various public platforms, just to also come and just show you, based on what was put there out in the public, what are those data governance considerations, and if possible, have any of us even thought about such information that has been published? What are the responsibilities from a governance perspective, and also from a patient management view? And then lastly is just talking about the lessons learned, and also what are those things that we need to do. So call for action. On my everyday, on my day-to-day, what are those things that I need to change and start addressing, so that we do not want to be left out finding with the information that we put out there. And also, just to put a picture, just to stretch our brain a little. So there we've got a picture stating that in times of crisis, good leaders emerge. One thing that we've realized is that as much as we were all in a pandemic, there's certain leadership traits that also emerged, and also just questioning some of our own internal self-reflection, just wondering what are those things that I'm doing that will better enable another person, and whether or not this leadership skills that I have, am I there to uplift others? Because throughout the pandemic, we've all been hit differently. Others, it's just mental health, and also from not being exposed to other people. What are those things in our leadership traits that also came out? So just one thing to highlight, that we've also seen good leaders that have emerged in all this crisis and pandemic that's happening across the world. So first and foremost, while we dive into it, we'll talk about public confidence, and just asking, with the information that you get to see in our public platforms, how much confidence do you have in that information being shared? So if we use the South African context of saying that we've got our president, which made sure that we've got those family meetings that needed to be conducted, and just making sure that he's giving us all the information possible, just to make sure that we're all comfortable with the information that's being sent from a public perspective. So the first thing, we talk about trust. When the president first came out and saying there's the pandemic that we currently have, there were a lot of questions that everyone across the country that was then asking. And then when the president came in to address us, there was that question of trust. Should I trust what the president is going to tell us? Is the information that he has, is he transparent? Meaning that, is it true and information that has been shared out or sent out or shared with the country? Just also looking at, also from an integrity perspective, is it true information? Can I trust where they're getting this information from? As in, when he's addressing the nation, did he go and make sure that he consult with a reliable authoritative sources, just to provide us with that information? And then lastly, from a reliability perspective, the information that was then being shared, is it reliable information? Because the moment you get to put information that is not reliable and people can question it, there's that question of, can I even trust the platform or the public platform that's providing this information? So you just always need to ensure that, even from our side, when we look at what the president's or the presidential office was providing, it was just always making sure that they give us reliable information, that we do trust that they have done all the due diligence required, that they would have gone and assessed that there's no misconception or wrong information that has been sent out to the public. So as and when we operate in our day-to-day, just also ensure that the information that we put out there, that people can trust it, that it's transparent, that it's also reliable. So it's not only from what we have seen from a government or presidential office perspective, but also us as individuals in this forum, let's also be cognizant of what is that information that we get to push out there to the public. So what we also did, just to also provide some form of context of saying, okay, Kulani, I hear you, you're saying that the information that I need to put out there, people need to be able to trust it, it needs to come from a reliable source. We're also saying that there's also a recipe for building and maintaining public confidence. And the recipe, it's as simple as 5 steps that we have put forward. Say 1, there has to be a regular engagement. The president just also made sure that he has regular family meetings. And as a country, we grew to understand and love. And at times we dreaded when he said there's going to be a family meeting on the outcomes of that session. So always make sure regular engagements needs to be held, because that way you're keeping your forum up to beat with the new requirements that then gets to happen. Secondly, learn and listen. So in learning and listening, so first and foremost, we had to first listen to what the president was then saying, giving us saying that from a Department of Health, what are those things that we then need to do? For example, the bare basics of sanitize your hands, wash your hands, maintain the distance, social distancing. Those are some of the things that in those regular engagements, he provided us with guidance of what are the things that I need to do in my day to day, which means he activated the learning aspect. As individuals, we had to learn or listen to what he was saying in this public fora, but as also from us, we also needed to learn what are the things that I need to do differently. Thirdly, establish collaborative ownerships. So also as an example, when the president stands there and he starts talking about some of this issues that we're then facing from a COVID perspective and pandemic perspective, there was also collaborations that needed to happen. Example, we've got the pharmaceutical department and also the Department of Health together with the presidency. So which means each and every time he had to come and address the family gathering or the regular engagements that we'll have with him addressing the nation, there had to be those collaborative engagements that needed to happen. Example, from our Department of Health, we needed to make sure that we're getting true and accurate information, meaning that ownership, when we say collaborative ownership, that ownership of ensuring that the stats then get sent out to the people, Department of Health need to ensure that they would have put measures in place to mitigate against any control that might have missed. So they made sure that the information that they provided to the presidency, it's true and accurate. From the pharmaceutical area, it's just saying, what are those things that people can better take while they're sitting at home to also help self-medicate while we're dealing with the massive numbers of people that are then being hospitalized. So obviously that collaboration needed to happen. So also when with the rest of us, when we're putting our information there into the public, just make sure that you have authoritative collaborations that have then been established to help you and ensure that the information that you send out there is also reliable. The fourth one, and I would put the example there of we had our president going and getting vaccine from India. And the questions that could have been better asked there, it's the question of if we're then receiving this vaccine, what is then the expiry date? Because now if those questions not being asked, now we come back and when the vaccine is in the country, there's a possibility that it might not reach all the individuals that needs to have this vaccine, also from a logistic perspective, but also because the time for the expiry date for that vaccine was coming too close. And then lastly, be vulnerable. So this is just saying in you being vulnerable, just be okay with there are mistakes that will then be made. As in when you're sharing your information in the public fora, but just making sure that you also go back and you rectify your mistakes and also publicly come out and saying, we've missed the boat. Because the moment you get to be vulnerable in the public eye, you're also showing the emotions that you're also human. But at the same time, it's not just only saying be vulnerable and not do anything about it. It's just making sure that you are aware that there's certain things that we might not have correctly ticked off the checklist, but you are coming out and saying we have missed the boat and we're sending out the communication like that. The other example we can provide with our president, at the point in time, I think it was early on this year, where he actually came out into the public fora and he just cried and saying, guys, I don't think we're taking this pandemic seriously. The way we are operating as a country and as individuals, we are not taking this seriously. And you'll see with that opening up of the president, we also got to see other people from the public, either they grew to love him or they hated it or questioned it. But for majority for the country, there was that sense of, he's human, he cares about us, he feels like we can do something different. So it's some of those things that you also need to be aware that looking at this recipe guidelines, always be aware of the information that you put out, how it's then going to be received, also whether or not people will then be learning or questioning the authenticity of the information that you then get to put out there. And then I will hand over to my colleague, Happy, and then he will take you through the rest of the slides. Thank you, Happy.
Thanks, Kulani, for such a wonderful opening. I think you have laid a good foundation, something that we might have forgotten to mention. It's for the guys online to fasten the seatbelt because it's about to get really hot. Okay, colleagues, here's a question. Let's start talking. Do you trust the water you're getting through your tap via the municipal connection? If yes, why or why not? Can I get volunteers? If not, I'll pick anyone I wish. Just give us your view. Do you trust the water you're getting through from the municipality? I'm not seeing any hand. I'm going to pick up. Oh, Howard, I see your hand.
Yes, I trust, not so much in Cape Town, but I certainly trust in Johannesburg.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's an interesting part. So the question is, why do you trust Joburg and why not Cape Town?
The interesting thing is the Joburg water tastes really nice, but in Cape Town, in Simonstown, it's awful. And maybe I'm just fussy, but so, you know, and I've seen my daughter as well. Now she lives on bottled water, so I'm not sure what happened.
Wow. Definitely there is something there. So the Joburg one that you trust, Howard, what makes you trust the water? What makes you trust the whole system? What comes to your mind when you go to the tap and try to get a glass of water? What gives you that comfort that this water I can trust? I can drink?
It's an interesting question, Happy, because I do trust it. It tastes nice. I always enjoy the water. And interestingly, when I was working with Standard Bank, there's a few of us that went over to Austria, and one of the guys drank from the taps in the gardens in London, Common Gardens. And he was so sick for almost 4 or 5 weeks. For the whole time that we were there in Austria, he was in hospital. And that really taught me to, be aware of the water and be careful before you drink it. But I suppose we've lived with the water in Johannesburg our whole lives. It really, and you don't, the only time you see brown stuff coming out of your taps is when the water's been off and they're fixing the pipes or something like that.
Thanks, Howard, for the insight. I saw another hand that came through and it quickly dropped. Is there anyone who want to take on and just give us their insight in terms of whether they trust the water or not? And if yes, why? Drew?
It was me. It wasn't Drew. Hi. Sorry.
Go first.
So yeah, no. Howard beat me to it. I was going to say I do trust the water, and maybe I have the benefit of having worked at Water, and I understand the whole process of what they do. So
for that, I guess when I go deeper into this topic, you become handy. I saw Akon as well have got hand up. Drew, you've got your hand up as well.
All right, so I do trust the water I drink, and I think it's because I'm on the other side of the mountain from where Howard is. But interesting enough, when we went through that severe drought, it actually caused us to be way more mindful of the scarce resource of the water, not to abuse it. And we still, I think, are carrying on with those best practices.
Yeah, it's great that it left a lesson behind, and we all now know how to act responsibly with these resources, because at some time they will be depleted if we are not cautious with them. I see another hand. I think it might be, I'm not sure who's hand.
It's me, yeah?
Yes.
Akon here.
Yes, Akon.
Basically, I stay by what you call it, Hartebees. and I don't trust the water at all.
Why
Funny,
not?
Oh, yeah.
but I trust. Jesus, you should see the colors in the morning of the water is brown. That's how bad it is. But I trust the water. I work in Centurion in Pretoria. I trust the water in Pretoria, and I think I trust the water from Rand Water, basically. But it depends on the company that the water is coming from. And with another view to it, when I went overseas, I went to London a couple of years ago, and I thought I would trust the water from England, and I got sick for 3 days.
Wow.
Drinking water from the tap. Yeah, that's how bad it was.
Yeah, it's bad.
Very interesting. So, colleagues, if you are on the line and you're still trying to wrap your mind about what is this data governance thing, because people are talking about data governance. I'm in the data science space, I'm in the MI space. I just can't get grasp of what this data governance is all about. I put this analogy to put us to ease with this concept of data governance. So all the comments I'm hearing here that talks about trusting the water, there is a logic or a theory behind. The theory behind is always that I trust the processes. I trust the fact that this water went through a water treatment plant. There are controls, there are regulations that are being followed to make sure that you prevent contamination of the water so that it doesn't cause havoc in the community. Ultimately, that's the thinking that we have. It might be an assumption, because I think I can send a message through that it might be that you feel you are in the first world, in the second world kind of country, and you are comfortable with whatever facilities that are there. That might not always be the case. The idea here is that we always trust because there is always an assumption or even the knowledge. I think Dineo was spot on to say she worked through the whole process. She understands. She can trust it because she understands what went into the water cleansing process and how it gets to a house. So for a layman who doesn't know, it might be trigger a bit of doubt, but go and find out for yourself so that you can decide what to trust or not. How then do we transition between governance and public confidence? So, like I said, if you're still hoping understanding governance, take your mind through the water cleansing process and the fact that you believe there are controls, you believe that this water is out somewhere where it's fenced and not everyone or any animal can get into the yard and contaminate the water. That's actually the same thing with governance. The only difference here is that we are talking about two different resources, but the nice thing about both of them is that they tend to seem liquid. They tend to flow, all of them. So with that in mind, you can see the definition there from the DMBOK that says exercise of authority and control over the management of data assets. Ultimately, governance is all about exercising controls, understanding who needs to have access to the data and why, who can do what with the data. That's exactly what governance is all about. But the question is, now I kind of like have an idea of this governance thing. Kulani laid a foundation around public confidence. How then do I measure the two? How do the two come through? The obvious thing is that, guys, when we're being told a story, there is mostly the numbers behind the story. The simple question is, how do I trust the numbers? Because the numbers informs the story. If I have to trust the numbers, there need to be something that triggers my thinking that those numbers indeed have been validated one with the other. They went through the same water treatment plant, and I can assure you that I'm then comfortable because I trust the controls in the plant. That is the same thinking around governance. Take the data through the same treatment plant. Same will do with your water. Kulani, may you move to the next slide? Great. So, colleagues, we have seen things making rounds across the world and even locally. We've seen a lot of things that we have discovered. You see, for example, there on the picture, it says 2 Kaizer Chiefs players test positive for COVID-19. The other one says coronavirus. Orlando Pirates midfielder Musfari tests positive. So when the first time I saw these two, because I'm a soccer fan, the first time I saw these two, I started asking myself questions. Why is the other team disclosing and the other team not disclosing? And believe you me, it has nothing to do with which team I support. But it has to do with a governance mind. To say, why would the one team disclose, the other team just mention that players? So the first thing that came to my mind is that these are some of the influential figures in South Africa or even beyond South Africa. So the question is, if we were to build public confidence, what kind of a message are we driving through? Did the player consent to this? Is the player aware that this information was going to be communicated? The question, those are just some of the questions from a governance perspective that you need to ask yourself. Why isn't the player who's the one who came out and say, I tested positive for COVID-19? What is the concern? In light of the regulations now that we need to implement by the due date, what is the considerations from this management of these clubs or the media in particular before you can drop such a bombshell? Now you see there is a growing trend of stigmatization against people who have been diagnosed with COVID-19. If I didn't consent, who is to blame? Who takes the hit? So these are some of the things that they seem very light, but from a data governance perspective, they are very important. If I recall well, this incident of actually naming the players, I think it was 2-3 players that were named. After then, teams would just say, so and so players, this number of players have tested positive for COVID-19. So it triggered a lot of thinking in my mind whether indeed there was consent and indeed there were a lot of questions from the player and the player's representation, whether could you really just disclose. Let's start bringing Papaya into the conversation and say, how are we building public confidence as influential figures if we cannot abide by some of the rules, if we cannot do the right thing? Let's assume that maybe he actually gave consent. We will leave it there. We move to the next slide. Oh my God, what an interesting one. So I think all of us, we've seen the rounds, we've seen what has been happening in the USA, and we have been monitoring the situation very closely. And these are just some of the things that you ask yourself. Are we building public confidence? Are we talking the story that has got the numbers behind? Who is fooling you here? What's the credibility of the stats? What do I need to believe? So as you can see, the bubble there is asking when the statement like the risk of when the statement was saying the coronavirus is very much under control in the USA. This was the Twitter somewhere in February. The question is, what was the state saying? You will do the numbers and then you will think about it. So these are just some of the things that really distort public confidence, because building public confidence is about being factual. It's about being honest. As Kulani has mentioned, it's about being trustworthy. It's about being reliable. Can we go and verify that the numbers indeed we're saying that the pandemic is under control in the USA? I doubt if that's the case. So you can see all of this that is questioning, where is this stat coming from? All these comments, are they in line with some sort of stat? Is there an influence that gives somebody this kind of confidence to stand on public platform and dish out this to the nation? So these are just some of the things that as a governance, as a data person, you start asking yourself, what are the numbers behind this? What is the intention of this? Is there propaganda around? Is this COVID-19 even exist? Those are some of the questions that asking yourself if we can go into the media as influential figures and mention such kind of things. And you can see as well on the one that talks about masks that the president was not in support of masks. The question is that we have some steps that proves otherwise, because those who have done research, they've shown that wearing a mask minimizes the risk. So all these kind of things, the things that around, the things that is topical, that you look at them from a data lens and they give you different perspectives. In the midst of all this thing that has been happening with frustrations and trying to get the vaccine, you get an article that says North Korea accused of taking visa for COVID-19 vaccine data. So this just says to us, what is the propaganda behind? What are the numbers? Can we trust this vaccine if there is also already a suspicion of leaking and all of these kind of things? So when another company engaged with a vaccine, do you believe it's their vaccine that they've developed and tested? Can you trust the vaccine? Those are all the issues that bubble in our mind with the one thing in mind to say, what is the data behind the story? That's something that I want us to leave this session with, to always uncover the data behind the story and ask ourselves questions. Can I trust this data that informs the story? If you can't trust the data behind the story, you need to start thinking twice about the actual story itself. But some of the colleagues have mentioned that they don't trust water from certain sources. Definitely because they can see some of the characteristics that no proper controls were embedded in here, and therefore there is no guarantee that the right processes have been followed. So, and another important thing is for us to note that while the world is in this disruption, there is somebody out there looking for an opportunity. The data breach is out there, the data governance person need to be alert. You need to work very closely with your IT partners to make sure that you've got the right controls in the right places to minimize the exposure and the risks. Next slide, Kulani. Okay, I will hand over to Kulani to complete the presentation with us.
Thank you, Happy. And thank you for that interactive engagement that we had there. So lastly, as one of the last scenarios, just also bringing it back home and saying that from a Gauteng province, there were figures that were then sent out where there was questionable in terms of the figures that were then sent out from a COVID figures that were then sent out, right, from a public perspective. And now the question that we now need to start asking, looking at how Mr. Bean is now showing his face and saying, now that trust element is coming back again and saying that we trusted that correct information will now then be sent out to the public. And now we hear that not all the information was true and it's now questionable. The one thing that you start asking also from a data community is like, so where did they get their information? How come there was no validation that was then conducted? Who then is the owner of the data? Did this, the gap happen from the Department of Health or also from a provincial perspective? So just asking that question of exactly when did this quality issue happen in the process? Because the moment you get to know who the data owner is, and also from a stewardship perspective, you would have then expected that certain measures and controls would have then been put in place just to make sure that by the moment we put this information or the report into public forums, that data management requirements would have already been met and the quality would have then been verified. One thing to also that you don't want to be left looking like Mr. Bean and just saying, oops, yeah, the information is, yeah, it's iffy. So let's just also be mindful the information that we get to put out there. And then lastly, just wanting to say, now that you have seen all of these scenarios that we have pasted and just got the interaction from the group, is just now asking the question now, what is it that I then need to do? What is my call to action? What are those themes that popped up without us having to put it in a data management world, but just saying, using the basic things that we've got to see on a public forums, what are the things that we need to start taking into account as and when we share our information? So first and foremost, there's the ownership. As and when information is being shared, you need to know what are those data ownership accountabilities or business ownership accountabilities, that the moment we put it out there, what are those things that we're then accountable for? So knowing from an ownership perspective, the moment you put your information in a public forum, you need to know that I, the owner of that information, that my information is accurate, that it is of good quality, that I have received it from authoritative sources, and just making sure the moment I put my information out there, also from a data privacy perspective, I do not do or violate either my customers, my clients, or the example that we had of the soccer players, of putting that soccer player out for stigma or being scrutinized and people don't want to be close to him. So always be aware that there's an ownership model that you need to be accountable for as and when you put your information into the public fora. We've already spoken about data quality and also receiving it from authoritative sources. So you might find at times somebody will say, I'm an authoritative source, but there's also that question of what validates as the authoritative source. So there's a little bit of homework that then needs to be done. If we look at the examples that we have then provided in the session, where we looked at the government or the presidential office versus the Department of Health, between the two, who's the authoritative source? Do you trust information that you receive from the Department of Health or the information that you then receive from the presidency? That's left out for debate. You guys will then get to choose that. But also, when you look at the bottom side, we're also saying from how information is then received and also communicated to the public. There's also some data management things that we need to be taking into account. Example, how does that information flow? So we talk about data flows. We get information that moves from one specific hospital, then it elevated to the local government area where they're saying within this respective, let's say, use Centurion. The hospitals around Centurion, they have provided the information. We then elevated to the Gauteng department, which then rolls up to the SA country, reporting on that flow. So now we're saying from a data flow perspective, as and when that information is flowing from one entity to the next, as and when it moves from the hospitals to the local stations, to the provincial, to the government, as and when that information is moving, how sure are we that we've got all the data protection controls stipulated or have been put in place so that we get to know that our information cannot be breached, that all the people that have access to that information are the people that are approved for having access to that information. Also, as and when this information is flowing, there's also the question of how is this information then being shared? Because if then you're using email addresses or email accounts to share information, somebody can easily hack your email account, and there's some confidentiality or confidential information that might be stored that you do not want somebody to hack while in transit to the desired destination. Making sure that let's use authoritative and secure ways of sharing information. And then lastly, we're just saying that from a data protection, you need to ensure as and when your data is secured, it could be or it should be your information is secured from both internally and externally. So internally, we've got our own platforms. We spoke about the North Korea and being hacked for some of their data that they had. Where we're asking, say now, if you've got third parties that also get to tap into your information or connect to your information, now there's cyber threats that you need to worry about. You need to worry about that specific third party. When they get hold of that information, what controls and measures are they putting in place to ensure that the data that they have then received, they put in proper controls around it. Internally, we might say we've got our IT security partners that will make sure that our information is not left out exposed. They might put all cybersecurity measures in place, but it's just always just making sure that there's that shared responsibility both internally and externally as and when you share your information. And then lastly, we talk about data privacy. So using the example of that soccer player where the information was just sent out there saying that the question now, with all the regulatory
Hi,
talks
James.
that are currently happening,
Okay, thanks. And you?
somebody can you mute? Thank you.
Oh, what?
So now it, or somebody can
Oh,
mute
I'm
them.
not on.
Thank you. Lastly, we talk about the client or the customer or the individual where as and when we're putting or publicizing our information to these public platforms, we're also aware that the information that we put out there, we're not violating any data privacy requirements. We've got the likes of GDPR and also POPI, and saying that as and when you put that one person, because now there's, from a POPI perspective, we even say that there's a fine saying if the customer did not give consent for their information being shared, let alone in a public forum, they can claim up to 1 or actually 10 million rand for having their information being put out there without their consent. So these are some of the things that you also need to be aware. The moment you put your information out there, what are the regulatory and privacy requirements that you also need to note of? And for that being said, this is where we end the presentation. And what we would want to then do, it's also just play you or end this session with just a video or a clip just for 2 minutes. And then you'll just let me know if you guys can hear it. Pleasures of technology.
Thanks, Kulani. Can you maybe try the refresh button then see if it's coming through? That's on top there where there are two arrows of back and forth.
Cool. While this is coming up, maybe we can just start just getting questions, comments, anything that you guys would want to add while this video is coming up. We'll take 2 individuals.
I'm not seeing any hand. Oh, here comes one hand.
Looks like Howard's got a question.
Yes, Howard?
Yeah, I think what you guys have shared is tremendous.
And I'm Sean.
It's really the approach that we need to take with it applies to our data management or data governance, trusting data as well. We can certainly use both of these situations that we're facing to help us get the trust back into the data. And Caroline Mouton, I think she's on, and she shared a tremendous video on the difference between how Liberty Life shared their breach numbers and how Experian shared their breach numbers. And Experian kept on changing their numbers, where Liberty Life was consistent, the same message all the time, and the trust was just so good in what developed. And just everything you've said bears witness to this. Is you've got to get your numbers up to date. You've got to be clear, because when you're shaky, then the regulator is going to start asking more and more questions.
Thanks, Howard. I think that's a very great insight. I think there are a lot of these instances where it happens in this way, and I do wonder if the institutions that are responsible for this or that publish this kind of artifact, they really go deep and understand what kind of message and the repercussions that they're putting there. Because if you are in institutions, like for example a public servant, your crux should be, let my people trust me. Let my people trust that what I promise is what I'm going to deliver. When you start with such things, they start bringing a lot of questions. So, Kulani, thanks, Howard. I'm not seeing any other hand. I guess we can go ahead with the video.
Okay.
A lot about data governance lately. There are some things going on in Toronto. We've got Sidewalk Toronto in the United States. We've got Cambridge Analytica, people and their data and some of the concerns, challenges, opportunities. It's a big topic right now. So one of the main things is, how do we get involved in those conversations more?
Yeah. Well, one way to do that is to treat data as a shared resource, as something that we all can own together, we can compromise and make decisions around together.
And what kind of a process would one follow to do that? I know we've been talking about data trust. Is that something that we need to learn about and maybe consider together? I'm saying this because I'm in a city where we're trying to figure out what to do about data. Has, there's public, private, and there's opportunities within data, and there's risks. So how do we think through some of those things together? That could be one use of a data trust, yes?
Absolutely. Data trusts are great tools, but they're not deterministic, so that you can do lots of different things, engage in different processes, and bring in different communities. It's important to have the set of considerations that a trust asks answered, to be able to have really concrete conversations about how it is that we do this together. And that level of clarity is one of the best things about data trusts, is that once those decisions are made, they become legally significant.
It's interesting, because one of the major points that has come out of conversations in the last year is that we don't have a good mechanism for the use of our collective data, aggregate data. Not just me, but everybody maybe who lives in my neighborhood or in my city. So this might be one of the ways to have discussions about that situation, which is really, really exciting.
Absolutely. Data trusts are a way to take individual interests and also balance them with collective interests and maybe all of society interests. So different levels of consideration that you then bring into the governance process and are able to balance also public and private interests. So having everybody at the table is the best way to get the most out of something that we share together.
There's a lot to think about and talk about with this, so I'm really excited to keep doing that.
Me too.
Great stuff. Thanks, Kulani, for that. I guess what this it's actually asking us is this concept of data trust. You know, how do we make sure that we build this data trust in our individual capacities? So you would have realized that so with the pandemic and everything that has happened, there is a lot of things that we can learn from a data perspective. In my view, what we have seen, it's actually putting data governance at the center of what we do, because it starts asking questions about the numbers and the story behind. We've seen the beginning of the pandemic, and then organization had to re-engineer the way they work. And then with that, it questions a lot around what kind of data do you have about your clients. You can't see them, they're in lockdown. Can you communicate with them? Do you even have their right telephone numbers? If there are no right controls, the chances are not. If there is no good data quality, the chances are not. Then what happens? I've got my money with you as an institution and I can't reach you, can't reach me. What confidence are you building out? Are you inspiring me that I'm still safe, I'm still catered for? You know, so these are the little considerations that to me, they actually bring data governance at the center of what we do. And if we take this message very seriously, I think we'll go very far in terms of the data and how we treat the data, how we interact with the data, and how we build that trust, because it's just beyond you as an organization. So maybe in a minute, I'll just share some of my experiences in my previous life, having worked in the health department. So it's interesting how Kulani was articulating the story, things like data flow and data sharing and all of that. Many years back when I worked there, I understood some of the challenges faced there. So in my mind, when questions such as the Gauteng stats are being questioned, it just triggered some of the things that I've seen before. So it's always very difficult when you are consolidating data from various institutions. At the time, the processes were still manual. You still have boxes that are being delivered with buckets and all of that. So that's where it brings a lot of questions in terms of how accurate, and if whether we are not reporting on exclusions, whether we are sticking to our word, or whether we are validating through the processes. So I think we will be left with about 5 minutes or so. Kulani, I don't know if there is anything from your side in closing. You're on mute.
That yeah, case of the mute button. Thank you for that, Happy, and thank you for this forum, for the opportunity. I think another thing that we also needed to highlight, it's also the misconception of what data governance is. Just simplifying it in a manner that everybody gets to understand, and in a manner where it's not such a heavy topic, because people just think you're the government when you then come in. I think what we have also tried to make sure that we achieve in this session is just making people aware that in your day-to-day, there's a lot of governance requirements that you need to take into account. Sometimes it's in the most simple thing of just having to drink water from the tap, and the governance requirements that were then taken into account. So I hope with what we have positioned today, it triggers another way or a new way of thinking, but also from what is it that I will then start doing differently, and be cognizant of the data that I have. Do people trust it as and when it's sitting in the public forest? So thank you, Howard.
Great stuff. Thanks, Kulani. Drew, over to you.
So from my side, it's been a wonderful presentation. I love the examples that you guys used, particularly the family gatherings, because I always was quite a rebellious child, and I have to say sometimes I felt a bit rebellious too. That I hate being told what to do. I like to be asked, but be that as it may. No, it's been really, really good. The comments that are coming through on the chat are very, very glowing. So I suppose the only question is, what are you going to present next week, next month? Howard, you want to wrap that?
We've got a toolbox loaded, Drew. Please don't test us.
Howard.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Happy. We actually there's another Wednesday session as well for data governance and ethics, and I think a lot of what you said is also applicable in the ethics area as well. So that topic is really heating up, And if you've got anything to share on that side, and the privacy, ethics, culture, all of these things come together in what you're saying, because we start to develop a new culture of trust in the data and value that we see in the data. But guys, thank you tremendously for your presentation and the effort that you put in. I know it sometimes you think it'll take a couple of hours. It certainly takes a lot more. Happy and Kulani, thank you very much. Any questions from the audience? I know we haven't really, well, we have, but I don't think too many people came forward. Happy, I think you were going to threaten some people with questions.
No, Howard, they are more than welcome. I think we left with about a minute or so. If everyone have got something burning, you're more than welcome to ask us.
And I know that Caroline has been preaching the same message of getting the right numbers when you're talking about privacy. Caroline, is there anything you'd like to share in terms of this, in terms of communication and the important aspects of this job?
Yeah, I think, you know, the confidence in data governance, I really love those examples of, you know, will you trust the water in the tap? And it just got me questioning, like, yes, do I trust the water? And it's like, yes, I do. And I think it's because I trust that there are quality processes in the background, and that there's somebody has got ownership, somebody is responsible and accountable for making sure that that is tested on a regular basis, and that there are checks and balances in place. And for that to happen, I know that it has to have been prioritized. And the reason I know it's been prioritized is because people are assigned to look after it. So I think in the same way, you know, when you talk about privacy and data, you know, sort of does the general public trust your data? And trust, I mean, if I log onto my account and I see that my address is wrong in 3 different places, you know, if I have different addresses in 3 different places, I start questioning the data governance and the importance of data governance to an organization, because it's evidence-based for me. You know, I drink water from the tap, I don't get sick, ergo my assumption that someone's responsible has paid off. So I think it's the same with data governance, exactly what you're saying. You know, it boils down to quality checks, ownership, checks and balances, and making sure that people are assigned and that it is prioritized. So yeah, I really appreciate, I really love that that side that you showed about, you know, how data governance, what data governance actually looks like. And I think that was a very good practical example. So yeah, thanks guys. That was great.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Caroline. Anything else? Anybody else? Great. Guys, we certainly look forward to seeing you again during the month. There's still more to come. So really look forward to chatting again, and anybody again as would like to reach out and share some of this. I know what we would like to do as well is to have almost specific areas like data modeling, data protection, data governance and ethics, data architecture. So the more the merrier, the more we can share. I think it helps everybody. So thanks everybody. Thanks Happy and Kulani. I really appreciated the session. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank
I'll
you.
second that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.